Welcome to episode 2 of Learning Jazz Language. Today, I'm super excited to have one of my favorite players, one of the best dudes in the universe, Adam Larson, with us. Thanks for doing this, Adam.
Hey, thanks for having me, Nick. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, and before we get into the actual content of what we're going to talk about here, wanted to let everybody know that we're going to have Adam in for a masterclass about the material that we're going to talk about today, and that's going to be January 8th at 4 p.m. Eastern, and there'll be all sorts of details in the description on how you can attend that. But I'm really excited to have Adam in for that masterclass and really get a little bit deeper than what we're going to get into today. But what we want to talk about, I did episode 1 with Steve Cortica, and we talked a lot about like harmonic vocabulary. And I think when we think about vocabulary, or at least a lot of us, I know I do, we think about notes, we think about structures, we think about chords, right? But what we want to talk about today is thinking about your vocabulary in rhythmic terms. And I think that that's just as important, if not more important. So, what are some of your approaches to learning vocabulary in a more rhythmic sense, where you're maybe thinking about that first?
Sure. Well, first of all, wrapping your mind around the fact that as a saxophone player, you can practice rhythm. If I take a poll of a lot of students when I do master classes or more private studio, hey, you're practicing rhythm in the saxophone? It's kind of like beep, nothing. Like, what does that mean? Um, I think Sonny Rollins is a great example that comes to mind immediately of somebody who the content of what he plays is amazing, but the way he delivers that content is equally as amazing or even more so. And it's done through rhythm. And a classic example of that is Sunny Moon for Two, Night of the Village Vanguard. The first 6 choruses of that solo are just the root and the fifth practically, maybe the
Yeah,
third, if he's
yeah,
feeling spicy. But it's really masterful use of just basic notes, but the way he's delivering those notes is that's where the rhythmic capacity and depth is just kind of overwhelming. So for me, I've always been really conscious of my own individual time feel. So, we talk about rhythm in terms of, okay, what rhythmic values are we using, but also how does my time slot into a grid? Am I ahead of the beat? Am I behind the beat? Is it deliberate? Is it not deliberate? Think about the difference when you hear Dexter Gordon play an eighth note, right, versus the way Sonny Stitt plays an eighth note. The same note, same eighth note, but in terms of the grid, one's over here and one's over there. So that's part of rhythm. But I think what we'll talk about more specifically is how do we develop a good time feel with certain subdivisions so that we have the ability to feel confident in playing chord notes and letting some space go by, or playing some
okay,
eighth note triplets and going in between eighth note triplets and any other subdivision or whatever. But I think
yeah,
one of the common things that I heard coming up, especially in school, I heard, play less, develop more, use more rhythm, so on and so forth. And when I was younger, I just ignored it. I just played more just out of spite. I was like, I'm a saxophone player. I'm going to play as many 16th notes as I possibly can, And I know you're a parent, and we're both getting on the older side of we're not dinosaurs, but we're not 18
right,
anymore,
right,
And so the
right.
older you get, the less maybe interested we are in exerting so much energy every single second of every single song. So I think the common critique you hear as a young improviser is jazz should be more of a conversation, or jazz should be more
Mm,
of a dialogue. And
hmm.
the follow-up questions are like, that sounds great, how did I do that? And the responses are somewhere between like, you gotta listen, or you'll hear it, or feel it, or something, which, like, I don't even know if it's well intended anymore. It feels just kind of lazy to say that, because most of the kids who are asking those questions, well, they're listening, they're trying to do that,
Right.
so and I think it's hard, to suggest something pedagogically that allows you to work on just rhythm, because as a saxophone player, a trumpeter, or whatever, we're so concerned about, like you mentioned earlier, content, the notes themselves, how to play them, the structure, however. But I think being able to uh, reduce the amount of content, so define it to a certain set of notes, right? Maybe the root and the fifth, or root third and fifth and seventh, right? It allows you to really focus on the rhythmic aspect of what you're
Mm,
trying to work on. Because if I found with students that if I say, hey, let's just play one chorus in a B flat blues, okay, with chord tones only, and I don't define the rhythmic aspect of it, even in the most well-intended student by measure five, they're back to eighth notes.
Right, right.
So saying, hey, these are the notes that you're allowed to use. We'll define them. This is the rhythm that you're allowed to use, and this is the structure over which we're going to try it.
Okay.
That's really hard for anybody, frankly. If you're an advanced player, it means you have to reduce the amount of stuff that you're able to play. If you're a beginner, it's terrifying maybe because I'm asking you to play with one, two, three, four notes,
Right.
in a specified thing. But we're all working from the same place, and I think that's something that, you know, as a saxophone player, as a non-rhythm section instrument, it gets inside of the, maybe the ethos of how to interact with people who aren't playing. This is not, it's a melodic instrument, but there's no pitches coming out of it, all things
Mm.
being equal.
Yeah, yeah.
So I hope it kind of, you already know my teaching style. I can get on a
Yeah.
tangent and just talk forever. So,
No, it's great though. It's
just
great.
giving you some ideas
Yeah.
on how this might work.
All those things super resonate with me. And getting a little bit more specific, one thing when we're practicing harmonic vocabulary that makes it, I think, a little bit more approachable is, if you sit down with a 251, or if you sit down with the first four bars of the blues and you say, all right, I'm going to focus on what notes I'm playing, or I'm going to focus on, specific chord substitution or chord scale or triad or whatever, it's approachable. There's parameters built around that, right?
Sure.
So when you're thinking about rhythmic vocabulary, I think one of the things that is intimidating to me, and I know to my students, is, I mean, there's an entire universe when you sit down to practice quote unquote rhythm. Do you have any ideas on sort of like limiting the palette so that when you actually sit down to practice, you can narrow things down to a manageable load?
Definitely, yeah. Well, I'm a firm believer that it all begins with the largest rhythmic value you can conceive of. So if that means you start with whole notes and making those feel good, fine. But more realistically, I think like when we think about four primary subdivisions to work from. So and it's part of what I call the rhythmic pyramid. So at the top of the
Okay.
pyramid, you have quarter notes. Then the second part of it, you have eighth notes, and eighth triplets, and then sixteenths. I've never met a person in my life who has bad quarter note feel, but somehow has really great eighth note triplet feel. It all kind of
Good
starts from the
point.
top, right?
Yeah.
So if you feel confident in your quarter note feel, that's going to, it's going to disseminate to the rest of what you're, the other subdivisions in that pyramid. So,
Yep.
yeah, I mean, and again, whether I try to speak broadly because I know that we work with all kinds of students from different levels, but if you're a beginner, this part of I should say, if you're the beginning part of your improvisational journey and you're trying to work on
Right.
rhythm, it would be it'd be challenging enough to try to just work on four notes, with one subdivision. And have it like forget about, and that's one thing too about doing this. I'm not so concerned about it sounding so melodic. Like the voice leading
Mm.
doesn't have to be. Forget about it. If you don't know what voice leading is, it doesn't matter. The
Hmm.
primary consideration is that we're following a very unique set of rules with one, two, three, four subdivisions. At a certain point. But the way you work through it is to develop individual strength at each time. Subdivision, right? And then over the course of working through it, maybe you say, okay, I want to now create a rhythmic phrase, right? So we start building out phrases that the notes aren't changing, right, of what we're pulling from, but in
Hmm.
terms of how we're going through it rhythmically, that's changing a little bit. So perhaps a bar of quarter notes and a bar of eighth notes, and that becomes how you associate your rhythmic phrase throughout whatever form you're working on, right?
Okay.
But for me, I mean, all the things that you may have mentioned that go outside of like there's so much rhythm, yes, right, but they're all going to be derivative of probably those one of those four bigger rhythmic subdivisions, right?
Cool.
So if I'm playing some kind of crazy triplet bass thing, if I started the Masterclass on the eighth and just started playing a bunch of triplets and said, now everybody, like, what is that? I think everybody would be like, black screen and they're gone.
Right.
So
Right. Yep.
but there's a logical way to get there, I feel, that allows you to see, okay, that sounds terrifying, but if you break it down and go back, all the way to chord note, eighth note, triplet, so on and so forth, there's some logic, associated with that.
Mm.
So, yeah, sticking the ideas to starting with the chord note, then eighth note, eighth triplet, and 16th, that's where a lot of our conversation, I would imagine, would kind of go into on the eighth.
I love that idea because it is a really logical way to break it down. It's a good place to start, move on to the next thing, move on to the next thing. Like, I'm a huge fan of that. I'm not a very smart guy. So it's like whenever somebody can, you know what I mean? Whenever I can have a logical progression through things, it makes me feel better, makes me feel
Sure.
safer working on it.
Sure, I understand that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So how is your rhythmic practicing? In your own practice time, how has that kind of evolved over the years? What does that look like today as opposed to, when you were a little bit younger?
Yeah, so I mean, funnily enough, one of the best things that ever happened to me for my rhythm was playing in high school marching band in the drum line. So I
Okay.
played snare my junior year, and I played tenors my senior year. And being forced to play odd groupings of things in my hands while I was marking time in four in my feet was, I mean, when I started playing saxophone, my dad's a drummer, and he was actually my drumline instructor for those 2 years at my high school. And when
Cool.
I started playing saxophone, I had a pretty good ear, but I couldn't read hot cross buns like in the music because my rhythm was so terrible. So to be able to have my dad couldn't wrap his head around it. He's like, "How is my son? He's the son of a drummer. He has no rhythm." So to be able to, like, I remember in high school I started working out of the Ted Reed snare drum syncopation book.
Yep.
And I would open up that and I would just read through that like on the note C.
Cool.
Just like one page a day, 2 pages a day to develop. You always talk about internal pulse, like our internal pulse needs to be great, our internal clock. Well, how do we do that? Do we practice the metronome? Sure, that's part of it, but we need to be able to look at a set of rhythms and instantly, just like if you see D7, you think, bam, that's what it is, right? If you see dot D dot D dot, you're not reading that anymore. It just becomes part
Right.
of your subconscious, but
Right.
it can't get that way until you do it. So, you know, um, my rhythm stuff now, to be very honest, like I learn a lot on the fly, which sounds kind of a cop out, but a lot of the things that I'm asked to do when I'm working with students, like I had a student yesterday who brought in a transcription of a great Will Vincent tune called Tripwire, which is
Okay.
in 15/8 and then has a bar of 5/4, and I felt like I was back in New York again. I was like, man, yeah, if there is music that is this complicated but sounds amazing. And
Right.
so that's like
Right.
you have to deal with a lot of stuff, and so for me now anymore, reading different music as much as I can. That's something that allows me to work on different rhythmic ideas. But honestly, teaching this lesson over and over in different lessons and having this conversation, I find out new things about myself. I realize that. For me personally, historically, every time I go into 16th notes, my time feel starts to creep up a little bit. I'm
Okay.
on the front edge of the beat,
Yeah.
so little micro adjustments that I make. And then this is one thing that is just a broader thing to consider for everybody, whether or not you join us on the 8th or not. It's just listening to yourself, listening to yourself with like a very, well, the word is escapes me, but listen to yourself to improve, so,
Yes. Yes.
because sometimes you can listen back and be like, oh man, it sounds great. But like, I would encourage you to figure out, okay, great, that's awesome. I'm glad you like some things that you played. Now, where can you get better?
Right.
And a lot of that has helped me try to implement the same things that I'm suggesting here into my own playing.
Man, yeah, that's always such great advice. And we all sort of like, we know that. We know we have to record ourselves, but so many of us don't do it because it's like too painful. Um,
It can be, but I think I feel like the flip side of that is like you get better at you get like if you're going through grief, you get better if you acknowledge the grief and you work through
right.
it, right? So
Right.
if you listen to yourself, you never listen to yourself, you're just like in denial, like, oh, I guess everything's fine, And then what happens is a year goes by and you're like, man, nothing's changing. It must be the music's fault. It's like, no, you have to address yourself.
Yep.
So yeah.
Absolutely. Man, such great advice. So this rhythmic pyramid, is this what you're going to really dive in depth into at this clinic on the 8th?
A large portion of it, yes. Rhythmic
Cool.
pyramid. We'll also talk about creating 1 and 2 bar rhythmic phrases. We'll talk about, because much like that Ted Reed snare drum syncopation book that I mentioned, if you took 1 bar out of that, then I
Hmm.
gave the example of 1, 2, and 3, and you tried to play one chorus, either beholden to chord tones or not, but just beholden to the rhythm. I've often done this. I've printed out like the chord changes that they'll never be another U, and in Sibelius you put in there, and then you put the rhythm you're using, and you try to improvise just with that rhythm. It's really hard. And again, it speaks to everybody's experience. If you're an advanced improviser, it's hard to not want to play something that objectively sounds maybe better or works better. But it's about testing your rhythmic flexibility and dexterity to make the best out of whatever the situation is. And if you're a younger improviser, it'll be terrifying because you're still trying to figure out what the hieroglyphics above the score mean. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, but
Right.
you're all coming from the same spot, which is like, here's the rhythm that I'm prescribing to you. Now deal with it. You know, so in the masterclass, I'll walk you through as much as I can through the pyramid, and then also give you real application over a form, or a couple forms, so you can see that it's not just like It's one thing I hate as a teacher and as a student is like, here's a bunch of exercises now with no expectation or explanation of how to apply it. It's like I found that older we get, the more we need and this is a whole other Zoom thing, but like we are all in expectation of instant gratification, which is
Mm,
dangerous in
yep.
arts and music. And so like,
Yep.
I can't say that you're gonna do this immediately. That would be, in fact, who wants to do that? Anything that's worth it, it's gonna take a little bit of practicing, right? But I
Right.
do want to make sure that if you come to this, that you have an idea of how to apply it and you can do it over the course of an actual tune.
Yeah, that's great. I totally resonate with that. If you think that anything is going to work and sound fantastic right away, you're dreaming, right? And
Yeah,
that's part of what makes like doing this so fulfilling, in my opinion.
of
You
course.
work really hard and then you start to see the results. But I love what you're saying because it is that practical application step that gets, skipped so
Sure.
many times. So it's good to know that sort of people will be walking away with, all right, I can go into the practice room and actually start working on this.
Definitely.
Beautiful. Well, really looking forward to the masterclass.
Me too.
And again, just so everybody knows, all the information on how to get into that is going to be below this video. And Adam, just thanks so much for doing this and taking the time and being our second guest on the jazz language episodes here.
Man, thanks for having me, Nick. I really appreciate it.